On the morning of June 2nd, 2018, the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland sat quiet and still in the early hours before class. The kind of quiet that belongs to kitchens before the day begins. Before the heat rises, before the chopping starts, before the smells of food fill the air and students crowd the counters. It was the kind of quiet Dan Brophy had known for decades. He had been arriving at kitchens like this one since he was a teenager washing dishes in Kansas City. 40 years of early mornings, of knives and fire, and the slow, patient art of turning raw ingredients into something worth sharing. He was 63 years old now, a beloved instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute, a man his students described as an encyclopedia of food. He had a degree in marine biology, kept bees, foraged wild mushrooms, grew his own garden, and never stopped looking for the next thing to learn, the next ingredient to understand. He had a dry sense of humor that people adored once they cracked through what could sometimes seem like a gruff exterior. His stepson described him as an affectionate grandfather. His colleagues described him as irreplaceable. That morning, Dan arrived at the Institute at 7:22 a.m. He turned off the alarm. He moved through the familiar routine, setting up ice water, starting coffee, getting the kitchen ready for the students who would arrive in a few hours. He was standing at a sink when the first bullet hit him in the back. He fell. The second bullet was fired directly into his chest. He had no chance of survival. 2 9mm shell casings were found at the scene. Dan's wallet was still on him, credit cards intact, $70 in cash, and nothing appeared to have been taken from the building. This was not a robbery. This was not random. This was something else entirely. When investigators arrived, Portland Police Detective Darren Posey looked at the scene and said, "Somebody just wanted to execute this person." He was right. Before we can understand how Dan Brophy ended up on that kitchen floor, we need to understand the woman who was married to him. Nancy Crampton Brophy was 67 years old at the time of her husband's death. She was born in Wichita Falls, Texas, the daughter of 2 lawyers. She had graduated from the University of Houston, moved to Oregon in the early 1990s, and attended the Le Cordon Bleu College of Culinary Arts in Portland, which is where she first met Dan, who was teaching there as an instructor. They fell into each other's lives and eventually into marriage. For more than 2 decades, they shared a home in Beaverton, Oregon. They cooked together. They took romantic trips, just the 2 of them. By every outward appearance, they were a couple who had built something lasting and real. But Nancy had another life running alongside the domestic one. She was a writer, not a wildly successful one. Her self-published romance novels had modest readership at best, and her writing career had never delivered the recognition or the financial reward she believed she deserved. She had written novellas and romantic suspense novels with titles like The Wrong Lover, The Wrong Hero, and, perhaps most tellingly, The Wrong Husband. She had joined the local chapter of Romance Writers of America in 2003. She had dreamed for years of being the kind of author whose name people recognized. That dream, like her finances, was not living up to her expectations. Nancy Crampton Brophy yearned to leave her mark on the literary world, penning tales of love, intrigue, and murder. But her aspirations often outstripped her abilities, with her writing falling short of recognition and her financial prospects dwindling. And so, in 2011, 7 years before her husband's death, Nancy sat down and wrote an essay. She published it on a writing blog. She titled it, "How to Murder Your Husband." She opened it with a line that, in retrospect, reads less like fiction research and more like a confession preview. She wrote, "I spend a lot of time thinking about murder. Divorce is expensive, and do you really want to split your possessions?" She went on to list 5 possible motives for murder: financial, lying and cheating, falling in love with someone else, being abused, and being a hired professional. She also walked through various methods: knives, poison, garrote, heavy equipment, hiring a hitman. And then she got to guns. She wrote, "Loud, messy, requires some skill, If it takes 10 seconds for the sucker to die, either you have terrible aim or he's on drugs. People who read it at the time likely dismissed it as the darkly comic musings of a crime-adjacent romance novelist. Writers explore dark corners. That is what writers do. But 7 years later, Dan Brophy was shot twice through the heart in his own kitchen. And investigators began to wonder how much of that essay had ever really been fiction. The Brophy marriage, for all its pleasant outward appearances, was under serious financial strain. The fall before Dan was killed, the couple had taken $35,000 out of his 401k account, about half its total value, to pay down credit card debt and catch up on more than $8,000 they owed on their mortgage. They were not people in free fall, not yet, but they were people gripping the edge. They were making ends meet by month, not by margin. Dan was a respected instructor, but teaching at a culinary school is not a path to wealth. Nancy's book sales were not filling the gap. Despite these financial hardships, Nancy paid the life insurance premiums with striking dedication. Paying over $16,000 in insurance premiums in 2017, the same year the couple fell more than $6,000 behind on their mortgage payments. That detail is worth sitting with. A woman who cannot keep up with her mortgage but pays $16,000 a year in life insurance premiums. That is not the behavior of someone focused on surviving the present. That is the behavior of someone invested in a very specific future. Prosecutors said she made claims on 10 separate life insurance policies, totaling more than $1.4 million. 10 policies, one husband, a very clear direction of intent. The prosecution's theory was not complicated. It did not need to be. Dan Brophy was content in his simplistic lifestyle, but Nancy wanted something more. As Nancy became more financially desperate and her writing career was floundering, she was left with few options, the district attorney told the court. But Nancy did not act impulsively. If the prosecution's case is to be believed, she planned this for years. Methodically. Carefully. The way a novelist might plot a book. In December 2017, Nancy began researching ghost guns, untraceable, homemade firearms with no serial numbers. Eventually purchasing a ghost gun kit online on Christmas Eve of that year, delivered in January 2018. The gun was never successfully built. She didn't have the skills to assemble it, so she tried a different approach. On February 17, 2018, she purchased a Glock 17 at a gun show. At the end of the same month, she purchased a separate slide and barrel for the weapon on eBay. Components that, investigators explained, would change the distinctive marks left on bullets when the gun discharged, effectively disguising the weapon's forensic fingerprint. She was not buying guns for home protection. She was buying guns and then modifying them specifically to make them harder to trace. On March 27, 2018, just over 2 months before the murder, Nancy went to a public shooting range in Oregon and practiced. She was preparing, rehearsing, doing the research that, publicly, she claimed was for a novel about a wife escaping an abusive relationship. Her defense would argue that same position in court, that the ghost gun, the Glock, the eBay slide, the shooting range were all for her fiction. But fiction does not require a matching bullet. The morning of June 2, 2018 began like any other for Nancy. That, at least, is what she told police. She said she had seen Dan before he left for work that morning. She had mentioned a leak under the sink. And then she had gone back to bed, she said, and spent the morning writing. She had not left the house. That was her story. Then investigators pulled the surveillance footage. Cameras from nearby businesses showed her gray minivan driving in the area of the Oregon Culinary Institute at around 6:39 a.m. She was spotted again at 7:08 a.m., just minutes before Dan arrived in his white pickup truck. And minutes after police believed Dan was killed, her van was spotted heading back toward home. She was there. She had said she was home in bed. She was there. When confronted with the surveillance footage during trial, Nancy's explanation shifted dramatically. She admitted she was the person in the van. She said she had been driving around the area for about an hour that morning. She couldn't quite explain why. She said her account of that morning was based on putting stuff back together, not based upon actual memory. She said she had a memory hole from the trauma of learning her husband had been murdered. The prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Sean Overstreet, was not gentle with that explanation. He looked at her and said, "It's critical moments that you were there in the area at the same time someone happens to be shooting your husband within a 6-minute window with the exact type of gun that you own and is now mysteriously missing. Is that your version of what happened?" Nancy replied, "That is not my version." But she could not produce a version that explained everything. The van, the timing, the guns, the missing slide and barrel that were never recovered. The Glock itself, the one she admitted purchasing, which was never found. Investigators say they never found the slide, barrel, or the gun that fired the 2 bullets that went through Brophy's heart. A gun that exists in purchase records. A gun that does not exist in the physical world. Because, prosecutors argued, it had been disposed of after it served its purpose. Meanwhile, as detectives quietly built their case through the summer of 2018, Nancy was playing a very different role in public. She wrote a tribute to Dan on social media. She attended his vigil. She wept. At the vigil, she suggested that Dan's ex-wife might be seeking revenge on him, offering detectives a lead to pursue, one they followed and promptly found had no basis in reality. She had misdirected them. Intentionally or not, she had tried to point the camera somewhere else. She told investigators that she and Dan had no enemies. She said they lived a quiet life, that he had never badmouthed a student in 25 years, that they loved to cook together and take romantic trips, that everything had been fine. And then police found the joint iTunes account. Saved in that account, bookmarked for easy access, an article titled 10 Ways to Cover Up a Murder. On September 5th, 2018, 3 months after Dan's death, Nancy Crampton Brophy was arrested. When officers came for her, she reportedly said, "You're arresting me? You must think I murdered my husband." Not the words of someone bewildered by injustice. The words of someone who had been waiting for a knock at the door and already had the sentence assembled in her mind. She pleaded not guilty. She would wait nearly 4 years for her trial to begin. The trial of Nancy Crampton Brophy opened in April 2022 in Portland's Multnomah County Circuit Court. It ran for 8 weeks, a long, meticulous dismantling of her story, witness by witness, document by document, surveillance frame by surveillance frame. The prosecution called over 24 witnesses. They brought in forensic experts who walked the jury through the ballistics. 2 bullets, both 9mm, both fired at close range, one into his back while he stood at the sink, one into his chest as he lay on the floor. They brought in financial analysts who laid out the insurance policies, 10 of them, totaling more than $1.4 million, with Nancy named as beneficiary on every one. They brought in digital investigators who had found the ghost gun purchase, the eBay slide and barrel, the shooting range visit, the iTunes account with its bookmarked murder article. They brought in Dan's colleagues and former students, who described a man so dedicated to his craft that the idea of anyone wanting to harm him seemed almost incomprehensible. They spoke of his kindness, his knowledge, his dry humor, his generosity as a teacher. Dan's mother, Karen, said, "I feel like through the trial, Portland has learned that our son was a great guy, and we really miss him." The defense tried to thread an impossible needle. They argued the evidence was entirely circumstantial. No eyewitness, no murder weapon, no definitive forensic link placing Nancy inside the building. They suggested the gun purchases were research for a novel. They suggested the financial situation was not as dire as prosecutors claimed. They argued that if the Brophies sold their Beaverton home, they would clear a reasonable profit. They even raised the possibility that Dan had been killed in a robbery gone wrong, despite the fact that his wallet and cash were left untouched at the scene. And then Nancy took the stand herself. It was a dramatic decision. Defendants in murder trials rarely testify, but Nancy did. And what followed was one of the stranger performances the courtroom had seen. She maintained that she had not killed her husband. She said she loved him. She said she would have been better off financially with him alive because they had plans. Sell the house, downsize, move somewhere simpler, reset their finances together. But when the prosecutor pressed her on the surveillance footage, on the van near the school, on the missing gun, on the memory hole that conveniently swallowed the most incriminating hour of the most important morning of her life, the story began to fray. Overstreet asked her if she has no memory of what she was doing while driving around. How does she know she didn't go into the Oregon Culinary Institute building? She replied, "I know I didn't go in the building because I know I didn't kill Dan. I know that for a fact." She knew that for a fact. But she couldn't remember the morning. She couldn't explain the van. She couldn't produce the gun. She couldn't explain why she had 10 life insurance policies on a man she was supposedly planning a modest retirement with. The jury deliberated. On May 25th, 2022, they returned a verdict. Guilty. Murder in the second degree with a firearm, constituting domestic violence. Dan's son, Nathaniel Stillwater, spoke after the verdict. He said, "We've all been waiting 4 years to start grieving this loss. To finally have some closure has been very important and meaningful for our family, so we can start to move on and always remember my father." 4 years. 4 years of waiting for justice, while the woman who prosecutors say walked into his kitchen and shot him twice through the heart sat in a courtroom claiming a memory hole. Nancy Crampton Brophy was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She was 71 years old at sentencing. She would need to serve to the age of 96 before she could even be considered for release. In practical terms, it is a life sentence. Now let us return to the essay, because the essay is not just a curiosity, not just an ironic detail for the headline writers. It is something more than that. It is a window. In her post, Nancy listed 5 motives for murder: financial, lying and cheating, falling in love with someone else, being abused, and being a professional, a hired killer. She also listed several methods for killing a person, including poison, garrote, heavy equipment, and hiring a hitman. She was thorough. She was considered. She laid it out like someone who had thought carefully about the architecture of the thing. And then she landed on guns. And she noted what it would take to use one effectively. The question that lingers, the one no verdict can fully answer, is whether How to Murder Your Husband was ever really fiction. Whether it was written as a dark creative exercise or whether it was something else, a rehearsal, a private accounting of what she was already, on some level, considering. Investigators noted it was apparent she had knowledge of firearms, of police procedures, and of how somebody might carry out a murder. One former prosecutor said of the essay, "I don't know to what degree she lost herself in her fiction. Was Nancy using her books as a trial ground?" That question haunts the case. Because the answer, if the jury got it right, is yes. She was. She was using fiction as a rehearsal space, as a planning document, as a way to think through something she had not yet done but was moving toward, slowly, in the years between writing and doing. And the doing, when it came, was not impulsive. It was not the explosion of a terrible moment. It was a sequence. Ghost gun ordered on Christmas Eve. Glock purchased in February. Slide and barrel from eBay. Shooting range in March. Surveillance footage in June. Step by step. The way you outline a novel. What the case of Nancy Crampton Brophy reveals is something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of creative ambition and financial desperation, and what can happen when the two intersect with a mind that has already spent years imagining the unimaginable. She was not a monster in the traditional storybook sense. She was a woman who loved books, who loved cooking, who had built a life with a man over 2 decades. She took romantic trips with him. She called him an encyclopedia of food. She wept at his vigil. She also shot him in the back while he stood at a sink getting ice water ready for his students. Those two things exist in the same person, and that is the part that resists easy explanation. Dan Brophy was 63 years old. He had spent 40 years giving himself to kitchens, to the craft of food, to the education of young chefs, to the daily act of making something from nothing. He was a beekeeper and a gardener and a forager. He had a dry sense of humor and students who adored him. He arrived early to turn the alarm off and get the coffee going on a morning that had every reason to be ordinary. He deserved to walk back out of that building. He deserved the retirement, the smaller house, the next chapter that his wife claimed they were planning together. He deserved better than to be reduced to a line item in a life insurance calculation. Better than to be the subject of an essay his wife had already written. Better than to be the answer to a question she had asked herself in public, years before she acted on it. His family waited 4 years for justice. The word guilty, when it finally came, was the beginning of grieving, not the end of it.